I found the bolt cutters lying on the ground next to my storage pod when I got home from work, and that's when I knew something had gone terribly wrong. My name is Nathan Quinn, and I had been living in the Riverside Meadows community in Phoenix, Arizona for about 3 years. It was one of those modern developments where everything looked pristine and coordinated, but that aesthetic came with a price. The HOA in this neighborhood was notorious for being strict, but I had managed to stay under their radar by following every rule in their massive handbook. I kept my lawn green, parked in my garage, and never left my trash cans out past collection day. I thought I was doing everything right. The storage pod was a recent addition to my property. I had ordered it 2 months prior, because I needed somewhere secure to keep some important documents and equipment related to a federal case I was involved with. See, I worked as a forensic accountant for a firm that contracted with the Department of Justice, and I had been assigned to assist with evidence collection for a major fraud investigation. The case involved a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme, and some of the physical evidence needed to be stored securely while we prepared for trial. My supervisor had approved using my home storage as a temporary solution since our office was undergoing renovations, and their evidence room was at capacity. The pod was a heavy-duty steel unit, about the size of a small shed, with a commercial-grade lock system. I had it positioned on the side of my house, tucked between my property line and the fence. It was barely visible from the street, and I had specifically chosen that location because it was out of the way. I never imagined anyone would bother with it. But there were the bolt cutters, lying in the gravel like a smoking gun. My heart started racing as I approached the pod. The lock was missing, just a jagged piece of metal where it used to be. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see that someone had been inside. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed my supervisor, Marcus. "Marcus, we have a problem," I said the moment he picked up. "Someone broke into my storage pod. The federal evidence is compromised." There was a long pause on the other end. "Tell me you're joking." "I wish I was." "The lock is cut, the door is open. I haven't gone inside yet, but this is bad." "Don't touch anything," Marcus said immediately. "I'm calling the FBI field office right now. Stay on the property and secure the scene as best you can without contaminating it. I'll have agents there within the hour." I hung up and stood there, staring at the violated storage unit. My mind was racing through possibilities. Who would do this? Random thieves wouldn't target a storage pod in a gated community. They would have no idea what was inside. This felt deliberate. That's when I noticed the HOA violation notice stuck to my front door. I walked over and ripped it off, my blood pressure rising as I read it. The notice was dated from earlier that day, stamped and signed by Karren Armstrong, the HOA president. It stated that my storage pod was in violation of community aesthetic standards and had been inspected and found to contain unauthorized materials. The notice went on to say that the pod needed to be removed within 48 hours or face daily fines of $500. Inspected. They had inspected it. Karren had broken into federal evidence storage. I took a photo of the notice and immediately called the HOA office. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. "Riverside Meadows, HOA. This is Debbie speaking." "This is Nathan Quinn at 4782 Willow Creek Drive." "I need to speak with Karren Armstrong immediately." "I'm sorry, but Mrs. Armstrong has left for the day. Can I take a message?" "No, you cannot take a message. Your president broke into my property today. I need her contact information right now." Debbie's voice became defensive. "Sir, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding. Mrs. Armstrong conducts routine compliance inspections. which are outlined in the HOA bylaws section 12, paragraph. She broke a commercial lock with bolt cutters and entered a secure storage unit containing federal evidence. This isn't about bylaws anymore. Give me her personal number. I'm not authorized to provide personal contact information for board members. You can file a complaint through our online portal and someone will respond within 5 business days. I hung up. 5 business days. By then, the FBI would have already arrested her. 2 black SUVs pulled up to my house 45 minutes later. 4 federal agents got out, 2 from each vehicle, and the lead agent introduced himself as Special Agent Robert Chen from the Phoenix FBI field office. He was in his early 40s, professional, and clearly not happy about being called out for an evidence breach. "Mr. Quinn, I understand you're the forensic accountant working on the Desmond case," Agent Chen said, shaking my hand. "Show me the storage unit." I led him and the other agents around to the side of my house. Agent Chen examined the cut lock, the bolt cutters on the ground, and the door without touching anything. He took several photos with his phone and then had one of the other agents start documenting the scene with a professional camera. "Walk me through what you know," Agent Chen said. I handed him the HOA violation notice. He read it carefully, his expression darkening. "Karren Armstrong," he said. "That's the person who signed this. She's the HOA president. According to the notice, she inspected the pod today. Those are her bolt cutters, or at least someone from the HOA's." Agent Chen called over another agent. "Run a background check on Karren Armstrong. I want to know everything about her." He turned back to me. "What exactly was stored in this unit?" "Financial documents related to the Desmond embezzlement case. Bank statements, wire transfer records, physical ledgers from 3 different companies. There were also 2 laptops containing forensic imaging of seized hard drives and several boxes of original contracts with signatures. Everything was cataloged and sealed as potential evidence. Was any of it classified? No, but it's all protected under federal evidence protocols. Unauthorized access is a serious crime." Agent Chen nodded slowly. "Breaking into a secured storage unit containing federal evidence can be charged as obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and potentially destruction of government property depending on what's missing. If she knew what was inside, this gets even worse." "There's no way she could have known," I said. "The pod was unmarked, unless she went through everything inside." "Let's find out." One of the agents carefully opened the storage pod door wider and we all looked inside. My stomach dropped. The boxes had been opened. Papers were scattered across the floor. The 2 laptops were still there, sitting on the shelf where I had left them, but one was open. Someone had definitely been going through everything. Agent Chen pulled on latex gloves and stepped inside carefully, picking up one of the papers. "These are marked as evidence. Federal case numbers right here on the header." He looked at me. "Your HOA president has created a major problem for herself." Over the next 2 hours, more agents arrived. They photographed everything, documented which boxes had been disturbed, and carefully collected the papers from the floor. A forensics team dusted for fingerprints on the laptops and the storage pod door. The bolt cutters were bagged as evidence. Agent Chen spent most of that time on the phone, coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's office. When he finally came back over to me, the sun was starting to set. "We're going to pay Mrs. Armstrong a visit," he said. "I'll need you to come to our field office tomorrow morning at 9 to give a formal statement. Bring any documentation you have about the storage pod, the evidence stored inside, and your interactions with the HOA. Are you arresting her tonight? That depends on what she tells us." But yes, most likely. She broke into federal evidence storage, That's not something we take lightly. After the FBI left, I went inside my house and just sat on my couch for a while, trying to process what had happened. I had lived in Riverside Meadows for 3 years without incident. I had never even met Karren Armstrong face to face. Our only interactions had been through the occasional community newsletter and one email exchange about a tree trimming service. How had this escalated to federal charges? My phone rang. It was Marcus. "Nathan, I just got off the phone with the U.S. attorney. They're taking this very seriously. The evidence breach could have compromised the entire Desmond case, and they want heads to roll." "I don't think anything is missing," I said. "The agents seemed to think it was all there, just disturbed." "That's not the point. The chain of custody has been broken. Defense attorneys are going to have a field day with this. We're going to have to document everything, prove that nothing was altered or removed. This is going to be a nightmare. Marcus, I'm sorry." "I never thought. It's not your fault. You had approval for the storage location. This is on whoever decided to break in. The FBI will handle it from here." After we hung up, I made myself dinner but barely touched it. I kept thinking about Karren Armstrong. What had she been thinking? Even if she believed the storage pod was an aesthetic violation, what gave her the right to break into it? The HOA bylaws were extensive, but they definitely didn't authorize breaking and entering. I pulled up the Riverside Meadows HOA website and navigated to the board member section. Karren Armstrong's photo stared back at me. She was in her late 40s, blonde hair styled in that generic suburban mom way, wearing a white blazer and pearl earrings. Her bio described her as a passionate community advocate who had served as HOA president for 6 years. She had previously worked in real estate before becoming a full-time volunteer for various neighborhood organizations. 6 years as president. That was a long time, long enough to develop a serious power complex. I went to bed early that night, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept imagining Karren Armstrong going through those boxes, reading confidential financial documents, maybe even trying to turn on the laptops. Did she understand what she was looking at? Did she care? The next morning, I drove to the FBI field office in downtown Phoenix. The building was an imposing concrete structure with minimal windows and heavy security. I went through multiple checkpoints before finally being escorted to a conference room where Agent Chen was waiting with another agent, a woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Lisa Rodriguez. "Mr. Quinn, thank you for coming in," Agent Chen said. "Let's go through everything from the beginning." I spent the next 90 minutes giving my statement. I explained my role in the Desmond case, the approval process for storing evidence at my home, the security measures I had taken with the storage pod, and everything I had observed when I discovered the break-in. Agent Rodriguez typed everything on a laptop while Agent Chen asked follow-up questions. "Did you ever discuss the contents of the storage pod with anyone in your neighborhood?" Agent Chen asked. "Never. I kept my work confidential." "Did any HOA members express interest in the pod before yesterday?" "No. I installed it 2 months ago, and I never heard anything about it until I found that violation notice." Agent Chen slid a document across the table. It was a printout of an email chain. "We obtained these emails from the HOA's server last night," he said. "I want you to read them and tell me if anything stands out." I picked up the papers and started reading. The emails were between Karren Armstrong and other HOA board members, discussing various properties in the neighborhood. The chain went back several weeks, just routine compliance discussions about lawn maintenance and paint colors. But then I got to an email dated 3 weeks ago, and my blood ran cold. The email was from Karren to the other board members, and the subject line was Suspicious Activity, 4782 Willow Creek Drive. In the email, Karren described seeing a large commercial storage container on my property and expressed concern about what might be inside. She speculated that I could be running an illegal business or storing hazardous materials. She proposed conducting an immediate inspection to ensure community safety. One board member, a man named Gerald Thompson, had replied questioning whether they had the legal authority to break into private storage. Karren's response was jaw-dropping. She wrote, "As HOA president, I have the authority and responsibility to inspect any structure on community property that poses a potential threat. The bylaws give us broad discretion in matters of community welfare. I will take care of this personally." "She planned it," I said, looking up at Agent Chen. "This wasn't some impulsive decision. She had been thinking about breaking into my storage pod for weeks." "Keep reading," Agent Rodriguez said. The next email was from 2 days ago. Karren had sent a message to the HOA's maintenance contractor, asking to borrow heavy-duty bolt cutters. She claimed she needed them to remove an abandoned lock from a community gate. The contractor had replied that he would leave them in the HOA office. "She got the bolt cutters from the maintenance contractor," I said. "She lied to him about why she needed them." Agent Chen nodded. "We interviewed her last night. She admitted to cutting the lock and entering the storage pod. She claims she had no idea there was federal evidence inside and that she was acting in her capacity as HOA president to ensure community compliance." "That's not a legal defense," I said. "No, it's not. We arrested her at her home at 8 p.m. yesterday. She's been charged with unauthorized access to protected evidence, obstruction of justice, and criminal trespassing. Her bail hearing is this afternoon." I sat back in my chair, trying to absorb this information. Karren Armstrong had actually been arrested. The FBI had moved quickly. "What happens now?" I asked. "The U.S. Attorney's Office will prosecute the case. Given that she broke into federal evidence storage, they're treating this very seriously. The charges carry potential prison time, especially the obstruction charge. We've also documented everything she touched in the storage pod. Fortunately, the evidence itself appears intact. Nothing was removed or destroyed, which works in everyone's favor except hers." "What about the Desmond case? Marcus said the chain of custody was broken." Agent Rodriguez answered this time. "We're working with the prosecution team on that. Because we documented everything immediately and can prove nothing was altered or removed, it shouldn't affect the case. But the defense attorneys will definitely raise questions. It's a complication, but it's manageable." I left the FBI office feeling surreal. In less than 24 hours, my HOA president had been arrested on federal charges. I drove back to Riverside Meadows wondering what the neighborhood was going to look like now. I got my answer pretty quickly. As I pulled onto my street, I saw a group of neighbors gathered on someone's lawn, talking animatedly. Several of them stopped and stared at me as I drove past. By the time I parked in my driveway, my phone was already buzzing with text messages. Most of them were from neighbors I barely knew, asking if I was okay and if the FBI raid the previous evening had been related to me. Apparently, multiple FBI vehicles showing up on a quiet residential street had caused quite a stir. I ignored the messages and went inside. An hour later, someone knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and saw a man in his 60s, wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt. I recognized him as Gerald Thompson, one of the HOA board members whose emails I had just read. I opened the door. "Mr. Thompson." "Nathan, I'm so sorry to bother you. Can we talk for a moment? I considered saying no, but I was curious what he wanted. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "I'm assuming you've heard about Karren," Gerald said. He looked genuinely distressed, his face pale and drawn. "The FBI told me she was arrested last night." Gerald ran a hand through his gray hair. "This is a complete disaster. The rest of the board just held an emergency meeting. We had no idea what Karren was planning. When she sent those emails about inspecting your storage pod, I thought she was going to send an official notice and give you time to respond. I never imagined she would break into it." "She planned it for weeks," I said. "The emails made that clear." "I know." "When the FBI came to my house last night to interview me, they showed me everything. Nathan, I swear to you, if I had known what she was actually going to do, I would have stopped her. This is not what the HOA is supposed to be about." "The HOA isn't supposed to be about breaking into people's property at all," I said, letting some anger creep into my voice. "Karren had no legal right to do what she did, bylaws or no bylaws." "You're absolutely right. The board has already drafted a formal apology letter that we'll be sending to you. We're also reviewing all of our policies to make sure something like this never happens again. And Karren has been removed as president, effective immediately. She's in federal custody. I would hope she's removed." Gerald flinched. "Yes, well, we made it official anyway. I've been appointed interim president until we can hold a special election. Nathan, I want you to know that the HOA will not be pursuing any violations related to your storage pod. As far as we're concerned, it's your property and you can do what you want with it within reason." "I appreciate that," I said, though I didn't particularly feel appreciative. The HOA's permission wasn't really the issue anymore. Gerald hesitated, then asked, "Can I ask what was in the storage pod?" "The FBI agents wouldn't tell me anything, just that it was federal evidence. I'm a forensic accountant. I was storing documents for a case I'm working on. That's all I can say. Karren had no idea. No one had any idea except my supervisor and the federal agents. It was supposed to be secure storage." Gerald shook his head slowly. "She's going to prison, isn't she? That's not up to me. But breaking into federal evidence storage is a serious crime." After Gerald left, I went back inside and tried to focus on work, but it was impossible. My phone kept buzzing with calls and texts. Some were from reporters who had somehow gotten my number, asking for comments about the HOA president arrested by the FBI. I blocked those numbers immediately. Other calls were from neighbors, some offering support and others clearly just fishing for gossip. The only call I answered was from Marcus, who wanted to update me on the Desmond case. "We had a meeting with the prosecutors this morning," Marcus said. "The FBI's documentation of the evidence breach was thorough enough that they don't think it will be a major issue. The defense team will probably make noise about it, but since nothing was actually altered or removed, it shouldn't affect the outcome." "That's good news." "Yeah, but there's something else. The U.S. attorney wants to make an example of this case. Breaking into federal evidence is rare, and they want to send a message that it won't be tolerated. They're pushing for the maximum sentence." "How long are we talking for the charges she's facing?" "Could be up to 10 years if they throw the book at her." 10 years. For cutting a lock and going through some boxes. It seemed excessive, but then again, she had compromised a federal investigation. The consequences were appropriate to the action, even if Karren had been too ignorant or arrogant to realize what she was doing. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. It was early June in Phoenix, so the temperature was hovering around 105 degrees even as the sun started setting. Most people were inside with their air conditioning, but a few were out watering their lawns or sitting in their garages. As I walked past one house, a woman called out to me, "Nathan, hold on a second." I stopped. She was in her 30s, wearing running clothes and holding a water bottle. I recognized her as someone who lived a few streets over, though I didn't know her name. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened with Karren," she said. "A lot of us in the neighborhood have had problems with her over the years. She's been out of control for a while now." "What kind of problems?" "Oh, you name it. Ridiculous fines for tiny violations, threatening letters, showing up at people's houses to complain about things. Last year, she tried to fine my neighbor $2,000 because his front door was painted the wrong shade of beige. Not even kidding. She had a paint swatch and everything." "Did he pay the fine?" "He ended up repainting the door, but only after threatening to sue the HOA. Karren backed down, but she made his life miserable for months. That's her pattern. She pushes and pushes until people either give in or push back hard enough to make her stop." "Why didn't the board remove her?" "Because she ran unopposed every election. Nobody else wanted the job, and the people who did want it couldn't win against her. She had a little group of supporters who always voted for her. Plus, she knew the bylaws inside and out. She used them like weapons." This was a side of the neighborhood I hadn't been aware of. I had kept to myself for the most part, focused on work and my own property. But apparently there had been an ongoing power struggle with Karren at the center. "Well, she's gone now," I said. "Good riddance," the woman replied. "I hope they lock her up for a long time." I continued my walk, thinking about what she had said. Karren Armstrong had been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, hiding behind the HOA bylaws and her authority as president. Breaking into my storage pod had finally pushed her too far, but how many other people had suffered under her petty tyranny? When I got back to my house, there was a news van parked across the street. A reporter and cameraman were standing on the sidewalk, clearly waiting for me. I tried to walk past them into my house, but the reporter intercepted me. "Mr. Quinn, I'm Jennifer Davis from Channel 8 News. Can you comment on the arrest of Karren Armstrong and her alleged break-in to your property?" "No comment," I said, trying to move around her. "Is it true that you were storing federal evidence in your backyard? Did the HOA president compromise an ongoing investigation?" I said no comment. "Please leave my property." The cameraman had his camera up, filming everything. I felt my frustration rising but forced myself to stay calm. Getting into an argument with a reporter on camera was the last thing I needed. The FBI has confirmed that Mrs. Armstrong was arrested on federal charges. Do you think she deserves prison time for what she did? I stopped and looked directly at the camera. Karren Armstrong broke into secure storage without authorization and compromised federal evidence. The legal system will determine the appropriate consequences. Now please leave. I went inside and closed the door, my heart pounding. I immediately called Agent Chen. "There are reporters outside my house," I said when he answered. "Is there anything you can do about that?" "Unfortunately, no. The arrest is public record now, just don't talk to them. Anything you say could potentially affect the case." I already told them no comment. "Good, keep doing that." The arraignment is tomorrow morning. After that, there will probably be even more media attention. This kind of case is unusual enough to attract coverage. He was right. By the next morning, the story had spread. Local news stations were running segments about the HOA president who broke into federal evidence storage. Social media was full of posts from Riverside Meadows residents, some supporting Karren and claiming she was being persecuted, others celebrating her arrest. I took the day off work and drove to the federal courthouse for Karren's arraignment. I wanted to see her, to put a face to the person who had caused all this chaos. The courthouse was downtown, a tall building with tight security. I went through the metal detectors and found the correct courtroom. The gallery was surprisingly full. I recognized several Riverside Meadows residents, including Gerald Thompson and a few other board members. There were also reporters with notebooks, sketch artists, and various other spectators. Karren Armstrong was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hands cuffed in front of her. She looked smaller than in her HOA profile photo, her blonde hair messy and her face makeup free. She sat at the defendant's table next to her attorney, a middle-aged man in an expensive-looking suit. The judge entered and we all stood. Then the proceedings began. The prosecutor, an assistant U.S. attorney named Rachel Morrison, outlined the charges. Unauthorized access to protected evidence, a federal offense. Obstruction of justice for potentially compromising an ongoing investigation. Criminal trespassing for breaking into private property. The list went on. Karren's attorney, who introduced himself as David Brennan, argued for bail. He claimed Karren was a pillar of the community with no criminal record, that she had acted in what she believed was her authority as HOA president, and that she posed no flight risk. "Your Honor, my client is a homeowner with deep roots in Phoenix," Brennan said. "She has been an active community volunteer for over a decade. This incident was a tragic misunderstanding of her duties and authority. She had no criminal intent and poses no danger to the community." Prosecutor Morrison stood to respond. "Your Honor, the defendant deliberately planned and executed a break-in to federal evidence storage. She obtained bolt cutters under false pretenses, cut a commercial-grade lock, and spent an unknown amount of time going through confidential documents related to an ongoing fraud investigation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was premeditated criminal activity that could have compromised a multi-million-dollar federal case. The government requests that bail be set at $500,000 with electronic monitoring." The judge, an older woman with steel gray hair, looked down at the documents in front of her. "Mrs. Armstrong, you are charged with serious federal offenses. While I acknowledge your lack of criminal history, the nature of these charges is deeply concerning. Bail is set at $250,000. You will surrender your passport and submit to electronic monitoring. Your next hearing is scheduled for 30 days from today. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down and it was over. Karren was led out of the courtroom and I caught a glimpse of her face. She looked terrified. I left the courthouse and drove back to Riverside Meadows, trying to process what I had seen. Despite everything she had done, I felt a small twinge of sympathy. Karren had clearly believed she was acting within her rights as HOA president. She had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, but I doubted she had woken up that morning intending to commit federal crimes. Still, ignorance wasn't an excuse. She had broken into my property, violated federal evidence protocols, and potentially damaged an important investigation. The consequences were justified. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to a strange kind of normal. The FBI completed their investigation into the evidence breach and confirmed that nothing had been altered or removed. The Desmond case moved forward without significant complications. Karren made bail, and I occasionally saw her around the neighborhood, always with an ankle monitor visible above her shoes. She never looked in my direction, and I never approached her. The HOA underwent significant changes. Gerald Thompson proved to be a much more reasonable president, and he worked with the board to revise the bylaws and limit the authority of future board members. Several of Karren's most aggressive policies were rescaled or eliminated entirely. The neighborhood started to feel less like a police state and more like an actual community. I testified at Karren's trial in September. The courtroom was packed again, with even more media attention than before. The prosecution built their case methodically, presenting the emails, the bolt cutters, photographs of the broken lock, and testimony from FBI agents about what they had found. I was on the stand for almost 2 hours. The prosecutor asked me to describe discovering the break-in, the federal evidence that had been stored in the pod, and the potential impact of Karren's actions. I answered every question factually and without embellishment. Then it was the defense attorney's turn. David Brennan tried to portray Karren as a dedicated community servant who had made a mistake. "Mr. Quinn, isn't it true that you never informed the HOA that you were storing federal evidence on your property?" he asked. "I had no legal obligation to inform them," I said. "But if you had, none of this would have happened, correct? If Mrs. Armstrong hadn't broken into my property, none of this would have happened," I replied. Brennan frowned. "The HOA bylaws give the board authority to inspect structures on community property for compliance purposes." "Did you read those bylaws when you moved in?" "The bylaws don't authorize breaking and entering. That's a crime regardless of what the bylaws say." "But you must understand that from my client's perspective, she was trying to fulfill her duties as president." "I understand that she committed several federal crimes. Her perspective doesn't change that." The prosecutor objected and the judge sustained it, but the point was made. Karren's intentions didn't matter. Her actions were criminal and she had to face the consequences. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Karren broke down crying as the verdict was read, her attorney putting a hand on her shoulder. Sentencing was scheduled for 2 months later. In the meantime, Karren remained free on bail, a ghost in the neighborhood she had once ruled with an iron fist. I tried not to think about it too much. I focused on work, on finishing the Desmond case, on returning my life to normal. But it was impossible to completely ignore. The case had attracted national attention, with articles in major newspapers and discussions on legal blogs about HOA authority and federal evidence protocols. Riverside Meadows had become infamous. The day of Karren's sentencing arrived in early November. I went to the courthouse again, feeling obligated to see it through to the end. The courtroom was less crowded this time, though there were still reporters and curious observers. Karren stood before the judge, her attorney beside her. She had prepared a statement, and the judge allowed her to read it. "Your Honor, I want to apologize for my actions," Karren began, her voice shaking. "I never intended to break the law or interfere with a federal investigation. I was trying to protect my community, to ensure that everyone was following the rules. I see now that I overstepped my authority, and I am deeply sorry for the harm I caused. I ask for mercy and the opportunity to make amends." The judge listened impassively. Then Prosecutor Morrison stood to give the government's sentencing recommendation. "Your Honor, the defendant's actions were not a simple mistake. She planned this break-in for weeks, obtained tools under false pretenses, and deliberately destroyed private property to access federal evidence. While nothing was ultimately damaged or removed, that was due to the swift response of law enforcement, not to any restraint on the defendant's part. The government recommends a sentence of 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Karren's attorney argued for a lighter sentence, pointing to her age, her lack of criminal history, and the community service she had performed over the years. He requested probation with community service and restitution. The judge took a long moment before speaking. When she did, her voice was firm. "Mrs. Armstrong, you have been found guilty of serious federal crimes. While I acknowledge your previous good character and community involvement, I cannot overlook the severity of your actions. You deliberately broke into secured storage containing federal evidence. You compromised an ongoing investigation. You violated the trust placed in you as a community leader. These actions warrant significant consequences. However, I also recognize that you did not destroy or remove evidence, and that you have expressed genuine remorse. Taking all factors into consideration, I sentence you to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. You will also pay a fine of $50,000 and complete 500 hours of community service after your release. I hope you use this time to reflect on the importance of respecting the law and the rights of others. The gavel came down. Karren slumped in her chair, her face in her hands. 18 months. It was less than the prosecution wanted, but more than the defense had hoped for. I left the courthouse feeling a mix of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, but it felt hollow somehow. Karren Armstrong would spend over a year in prison because she had taken her HOA authority too seriously. It seemed both appropriate and tragic at the same time. Back in Riverside Meadows, life continued. Gerald Thompson remained as HOA president and proved to be competent and reasonable. The storage pod on my property was never mentioned again. I eventually removed it after the Desmond case concluded, not because of any HOA pressure, but because I no longer needed it. The neighborhood slowly recovered from the scandal. New residents moved in, unaware of the drama that had unfolded. The HOA board implemented new policies requiring multiple approvals for any property inspections and explicitly prohibiting forced entry under any circumstances. The bylaws were rewritten to be less authoritarian and more focused on genuine community improvement. I occasionally thought about Karren during those months. I wondered what she was thinking in her federal prison cell, whether she understood the magnitude of what she had done, whether she blamed me for her fate. I hadn't asked for any of this. I had simply been doing my job, storing evidence as authorized, and she had decided to violate my property. The Desmond case concluded successfully in March of the following year. The defendants were convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement, sentenced to significant prison time, and ordered to pay millions in restitution. The evidence I had helped preserve and analyze was crucial to the prosecution. None of the defense attorneys were able to successfully argue that the evidence had been compromised by Karren's break-in, thanks to the FBI's thorough documentation. Karren was released from federal prison after serving 14 months of her 18-month sentence, getting credit for good behavior. I heard she moved to Tucson shortly after her release, living with her sister. She never returned to Riverside Meadows, and I never saw her again. The house she had lived in was sold, and a young family moved in. They kept their lawn perfect and followed all the HOA rules, but in a normal way, not in the obsessive way Karren had enforced. The neighborhood felt lighter without her presence. I stayed in Riverside Meadows for another 2 years before accepting a job offer in Denver and relocating. When I sold my house, the new owners asked me why there was a reinforced concrete pad on the side of the property. I told them it was for a storage unit I used to have, and they seemed satisfied with that answer. I didn't mention the federal investigation, the break-in, or the HOA president who went to prison. Some stories are better left in the past. Looking back on the whole experience, I learned some important lessons about power, authority, and the dangers of taking rules too seriously. Karren Armstrong had convinced herself that being HOA president gave her unlimited authority to enforce compliance. She had spent years becoming more and more authoritarian, facing no real consequences until she finally crossed a line she didn't even know existed. The federal evidence in my storage pod had been the catalyst, but the real problem was years in the making. An HOA is supposed to maintain property values and create a pleasant community environment. It's not supposed to be a tool for one person's power trips. Karren had lost sight of that distinction, and it had destroyed her life. I sometimes wondered if things could have gone differently. If I had told the HOA about the storage pod, would Karren have left it alone? Probably not. She would have found some other excuse to inspect it, some other violation to pursue. The bolt cutters would have come out eventually. Or maybe if someone had stood up to her years earlier, challenged her authority before it became absolute, she might have learned to moderate her behavior. But that hadn't happened. The neighborhood had let her run unchecked for 6 years, and by the time she broke into my storage pod, she believed she was untouchable. The whole situation highlighted the importance of checks and balances in any system of governance, even something as mundane as a homeowner association. When one person has too much power and faces no oversight, bad things happen. Karren Armstrong was the perfect example of that principle. As for me, I made sure my new home in Denver wasn't part of an HOA. I found a nice house in a quiet neighborhood with no community rules beyond basic city ordinances. No lawn maintenance requirements, no paint color restrictions, no one measuring whether my mailbox was the regulation height. It was liberating. I still work as a forensic accountant, still occasionally handle federal cases, but I learned to be more careful about where and how I store sensitive materials. The incident taught me that security isn't just about strong locks. It's about recognizing that some threats come from unexpected directions. Karren Armstrong taught me that lesson the hard way. She also taught the entire Riverside Meadows community about the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of respecting other people's property and privacy. Those lessons came at a steep price for her: 18 months in federal prison and a felony record that would follow her for the rest of her life. Every time I hear about HOA horror stories, about board members overstepping their authority or residents being harassed over trivial violations, I think about Karren. I think about how a reasonable goal, maintaining community standards, can spiral into tyranny when the wrong person is in charge. I think about how breaking into my storage pod seemed perfectly justified in her mind, how she genuinely believed she was protecting the community. The road to federal prison, in her case, was paved with good intentions and a complete misunderstanding of her legal authority. It's a cautionary tale about power, privilege, and the importance of knowing where your authority ends and other people's rights begin. In the end, Karren Armstrong broke into my secure storage pod, found federal evidence inside, and turned what might have been a simple trespassing charge into multiple felonies. The FBI arrested her, the courts convicted her, and she served her time. Justice was served, the federal case proceeded without significant issues, and life moved on. But somewhere in Tucson, Karren Armstrong is living with the consequences of one very bad decision, and hopefully learning that HOA president is a volunteer position to serve the community, not a license to violate people's rights and property. Maybe she tells her story to others as a warning. Maybe she keeps it to herself, too ashamed to admit what happened. Either way, the lesson is clear and worth remembering. Authority has limits, and those who forget that fact do so at their own peril.